Hi everyone. Today we're going to be discussing voter suppression and the efforts by the Republican Party to try to prevent individuals from being able to cast their ballots, their votes in our society. And this is critical or very important to at least take notice of because of the fact that without the ability to vote, those that are excluded don't have the ability to influence political outcomes, to affect the laws that are going to impact their lives, their daily lives. And it's also problematic for those outside of the United States who would argue that the United States is no longer, or maybe may not have been, a model democracy based on its history. But it's interesting that one major political party wants to prevent individuals from being able to participate in the political process, and another political party wants to make it easier, that is the Democratic Party, make it easier to participate in the political process. And so this raises some very critical and important questions about what direction is our country going? Are we going to be a society that's inclusive, that's embracing of diversity, and is it going to allow all people, no matter their ethnicity, no matter their religious background, no matter their cultural or ethnic history, whoever they are, they should have the right to participate in the political process. Now, in looking at the history of the United States, it's not a positive one when looking at the evolution of the institutions that were created, understanding that we function based on the separation of powers and checks and balances. At the Constitutional Convention in 1787, for example, they were arguing about who's going to be allowed to participate in the political process. And so when they couldn't come up with any resolution as to how they were going to who they were going to allow to involve themselves in the political process, they simply gave it up to the states. But at the same time, what the states did is essentially stipulated that only white males with property would be allowed to participate. And so this raises a very important question about the institutions that were the result of that Constitutional Convention, which was a compromise. That is that we were shifting away from confederation. Confederation simply means a system by which the states are the dominant units of government that dictate to the central authority what it can and cannot do. And so the end result was a combination of accommodating the states, but at the same time making sure that the central authority had effective power to be able to deal with the problems that were being encountered at the time. That is that there was issues involving taxation, the transport of goods from the inland states to the seaboard states, and goods being shipped off to Europe, and also the border disputes, possible border disputes. And so under Confederation, there was no military, there was no effective executive authority, and therefore, whenever these conflicts would arise or could arise in the future, you could envision, in a worst case scenario, war and conflict. So that was the goal at the Constitutional Convention. That is that there's going to be a lot of issues that are going to arise, but we're going to have to come up with a better system, a more efficient system than was characteristic at the time of the founding. And so in looking at the major institutions of our federal government, the majority of them, sad to say, violated the very essence, the very principle of democracy. That is, democracy is majority rule. And with regards to the House of Representatives, for example, only white males with property would be able to vote. Women could not vote. Obviously, slaves could not participate in the political process. And indigenous peoples, Native Americans, were being slaughtered and put onto reservations. And so it was a compromise in terms of we're going to have to accommodate the states, but we're going to have to keep our eye on the ball of trying to establish a more effective central authority. And so the end result was that the most democratic institution that was created was the House, but even there, it was limited only to the extent that only white males with property would be allowed to vote. With regards to the states, the state Senate, the federal Senate or the United States Senate. Here we would provide or stipulate that there would be 2 senators from every state, no matter its size, no matter its population, 2 senators from each state, which essentially violates the principle of democracy to the extent that smaller states today, like the Dakotas, for example, get 4 senators. North and South Dakota get 4 senators. California has over 30 million people and we only get 2 senators. In terms of equality of power, they have essentially more power than we do, these 2 small states. And you can go on and look at the other 50 states and compare large states to small states. So, but again, that was the result of trying to accommodate and reassure the states at the time to ratify the proposed constitution, because there was some question as to whether or not it was going to be incorporated. And so the Senate violates the principle of democracy. And then, of course, you have the president. How is the president? How was the president to be appointed or elected? And so here again, it was compromised. That is that we're going to establish this convoluted system called the Electoral College, whose members would be selected by state legislatures, and the people would have no direct voice in selecting the president or the vice president of the United States and into the future. Again, there was some concern or fear of having too powerful a president, and one way of trying to curtail the potential abuses of a chief executive is to essentially have this convoluted electoral college system that we've inherited since the beginnings of our republic. And the other issue, of course, is slavery, and so this would assure that the states would be able to, those slave states would be able to contain and protect the system, this heinous system that was part of our compromise at the Constitutional Convention. In fact, slaves were to be counted as 3/5 of a person. Unfortunately, sadly, that's in the original Constitution. And if a slave escapes, he or she must be returned to their so-called master. And the federal government could not pass, or Congress through the federal government could not pass any laws for 20 years preventing the importation of slaves. So this is in the original Constitution, which essentially legitimized this heinous system that was in violation of the very principles that the founders argued that they believed in. That is the principle of equality of all human beings, that based on natural law. But again, the goal was to establish a more powerful central authority. Now, as our system evolved, we became more democratic. In the 1830s, the system of democratizing the Electoral College became much more the result of the Jacksonian democracy, whereby no longer would state legislatures be selecting the electors for the selection of the candidate for the particular party in question. And then, of course, you had the Civil War amendments. The 15th Amendment provided for black males, former slaves, black males, the right to vote, and that makes it clear that there's to be no interference by the federal government or the states that would inhibit the ability of black males from voting. And then finally, in 1920, almost more than a century after the creation of our republic, women got the right to vote. So again, this process of granting the franchise, expanding the franchise in the United States was a gradual one. But ultimately we became much more democratic, but it was a slow slog. No, it was a slow process. And unfortunately, sadly, we went through the era of Jim Crow. No, that is that blacks that were newly freed were subjected to all forms of discrimination and bigotry in our society. But it was not excluded to just blacks, of course. Other groups were discriminated against as well. And the Irish, for example, even though they're white, they were discriminated against because they were perceived to be an alien group because they were part of Catholicism. No, they were identified with Catholicism and not Catholicism, because Protestants were the majority. They were the dominant group in our society. And so inevitably and eventually, through local control and through the franchise, they were able to at least limit the ability of the abuses that occur, of discrimination that occurred in the beginnings of their immigrating to the United States. With regards to African Americans, unfortunately, they through these nefarious policies of poll taxes, literacy tests, and later, of course, we had gerrymandering, a whole slew of means by which they were prevented from actually fulfilling their ability to participate in the political process and being able to receive the fruits and the benefits of our democracy. Fortunately for our society, because of the civil rights movement especially of the 1950s and the 1960s, we got the Civil Rights Act passed in 1964 and the Voting Rights Act passed in 1965. And with the Voting Rights Act, again, here was a policy by the then President Johnson to give power to those that were being, again, discriminated against, no? Because there are three sources of power when one thinks about the ability to influence our society. Money is power. In a democracy, the franchise, the mobilization of people to vote is power. And knowledge is power. That is much more the individual. If you become educated and aware of how our society works, how the system works, if you develop a skill set that's in demand in the job market, you have greater security and the ability to achieve more opportunities and upward mobility. But in any event, here we had critical legislation that was passed and a slew of policies that were initiated by the federal government to help at least fight off discrimination and racism. That was the effort. The whole point of being able to vote and the whole reason for the Voting Rights Act is to empower African Americans to protect themselves from the abuses by the majority. Wherever and whenever that transpired, they could now assert themselves and then take over communities like the Irish before them and later other immigrant groups like the Italians, etc. No, so with the Voting Rights Act, it served to provide for that very benefit. Unfortunately, because nothing in a democracy is permanent. We're always in transition and things are always changing. We have different personalities, different movements that are occurring, different power centers that are arising. And so these various interests are all trying to achieve some kind of clout or have some impact on our society as a whole. And so with regards to the Voting Rights Act, sadly, it was gutted. The Section 4B was essentially compromised because that was the critical section that would require any district or any region or state that would discriminate against blacks would result in the ability of the government, the federal government, to send in observers and require that they clean up their act. That you cannot be discriminating or preventing African Americans from participating, and you could be sanctioned by the federal government as a consequence of that. Again, the policies of, for example, gerrymandering districts where you minimize the impact of the black vote in a particular locale, limiting polling sites or requiring strict registration procedures that essentially resulted in diminishing or preventing unfairly the right of African Americans to exercise the vote. And so any marginalized group, any group that's being discriminated against, the way to affect and protect themselves from the society at large, by those that are inflicting unnecessary harm to them, is one way, of course, is through the franchise. And it depends upon who's on the judiciary will determine whether or not these issues can be dealt with effectively. Because if, for example, we can't rely on the Congress, we can't rely on the states, and we can't rely on the executive to come to the protection of those groups that are being attacked. In the past, at least, some instances, it would be the courts that would step in. And the reason that it was more likely that the courts could step in is because they receive lifetime tenure. You know, you got federal judges and justices on the Supreme Court that receive lifetime tenure. Now, on the negative side of that is that here you have individuals that are unelected and can be unresponsive to the very needs of the people. Or because they got that lifetime tenure, and this was Alexander Hamilton and Federalist 78, giving them this protection, this sense of security, they can feel free to make decisions that may be unpopular with the will of the majority, or instances where the majority is discriminating or violating the very rights of the people, the people that are being marginalized. And so that was the thinking at the time, no? But it depends upon who's on the Supreme Court will determine how they define what that Constitution stipulates and how it's whether or not it's going to serve the public interests of the vast majority or serve elite interests or the interests of the privileged few. It depends, again, upon who's sitting on the Supreme Court. And unfortunately, the example of gutting the Voting Rights Act tells us that the Roberts Court is not friendly to the vast majority of our society. Sad to say, it's not something that I say easily. No, I mean the Citizens United example stands out as one of the worst decisions in recent memory or history. No, that corporations are persons, and therefore, in any way of restricting their participation in the political process and the amounts of money that they give to candidates running for office is a violation of the First Amendment. It's ridiculous. It's sad. Because money is the mother's milk of politics, and if you allow one group to have a disproportionate amount of resources at its disposal, other groups are going to be at a serious disadvantage to get their message across. And propaganda does work. Lies do work. No, 60%, at least as at this time from recent reporting. At this point, after the January 6th insurrection, 60% of Republican voters still believe that this election was fraudulent. This presidential election in November was fraudulent, and it was stolen from Donald Trump, and that is blatantly false. There's no facts. There's no evidence of any significant fraud that occurred. And historically, if one were to look at the history of elections in the United States, it's so minuscule in terms of recent decades that there's been any kind of violations of law during elections or fraudulent activity occurring. It's just not practical. It's not logical. It's not even rational. Criminals are not going to be preoccupied with stealing elections. Common sense tells us that, no? They're preoccupied with, casing neighborhoods, robbing people at ATMs. They're not going to be concerned about who's going to be on the city council, board of education, or whatever elected office that one wants to discuss. So, and the reason that this is being used, this argument is being presented, is basically for the Republican Party to retain power. That's what it's about. It's all about power and privilege, retaining power and privilege. And they, based on what they've attempted to do in 47 of the 50 states, they've introduced legislation to suppress the vote in the United States, when in fact, in a democracy, you would think that, if anything, we should be trying to expand participation. We should be doing everything in our power to make it easier for people to vote, and we should be celebrating the fact that more and more people want to be engaged in voting and in elections. Because when people vote, they feel they have a stake in the society. They feel that they have some voice in the ability to affect and influence political outcomes in the laws that are being passed, and that gives credence, that gives legitimacy and integrity to our democracy in this country and outside of the United States. When we start to subvert that, when we start to interfere with that, when we come up with all kinds of restrictions and limitations on that, all we're doing is destroying our reputation internationally, because people are not fools. Those people, sizable numbers of people know what's going on. And they'll say, you know what the despots elsewhere would say? The United States is a sham democracy. Look at the decisions that are coming down, and look at how they prevent people from voting. They call themselves a model democracy, but, well, if they're a model democracy, why are they preventing people from voting? Why is that? It makes absolutely no sense unless it's about power and privilege. And if people are willing to steal elections, to cheat in elections, to manipulate rules to somehow prevent some groups from participating in the political process as opposed to others, that says everything negative about them. It says that they're not really in favor of democracy. They're aligning themselves with the forces of autocracy, of authoritarian rule. And anyone that has any sense of values, any belief in honesty and integrity in our election system would fight against that, would be opposed to that, no matter what their political persuasion. The fact is that our society is changing. The demographics show that. They estimate that by 2050, between 2040 and 2050, people of color are going to be the majority of the United States. But the white America they don't need to fear immigrants that are coming here. I mean, studies show this to be the case. That is, immigrants contribute much more than they take out of our society. They work hard. They're in the critical sectors, working in construction, agriculture, textiles, you name it. The list goes on in the areas that are in the service, especially the service areas where they are contributing to our economy. People are able to buy goods and services at a much cheaper price as a result of what they're providing to our economy. And the fact is that we have an aging population, especially if you look at the demographics among the white population. They're getting older, and so at a certain point, you're going to need those immigrants to be able to sustain and support those elderly, because they rely on Social Security and Medicare. And that taxation, the taxation that supports these critical programs, these what are referred to as entitlement programs, come from the younger people of our society. So to demonize and to ostracize and to marginalize and to vilify immigrants is going against what is necessary for our country. And the other thing about in understanding what's going on demographically, both political parties, but in particular, I'm talking to the Democratic Party, okay? The Democratic Party needs to understand that they have a natural constituency that they need to reach out to. They need to nurture and identify and train and develop leadership in those communities. They need to incorporate them into and bring them with open arms into the Democratic Party apparatus. And the reason I say Democratic, because the Republican Party makes no bones about its loyalties to corporations, to the well-to-do, in terms of their beliefs in cutting taxes for the well-to-do, in terms of their policies with regards to not being that preoccupied with climate change, and the list goes on some of the things that are not beneficial for our country. So I'll end it there, and I hope that some of these things that I've talked about resonate with a lot of you, and I hope to hear from you, and I'll keep an open mind. If you can give me some ideas or points of view that are in contrast with my own, it's okay, because we have a right to think differently. But here's my take, a Latino, a Mexican American, somebody from the barrio, that was orphaned as a kid, has his take, and I think that all voices need to be heard from all sectors of our society. Thank you, and have a nice day.